Good afternoon and welcome to this lunchtime talk. Now, the person who should have been sitting here chairing it, Katrine Forster from ABB, one of our loyal sponsors, couldn't come to Singapore this year, sends her apologies, and she's also sent this very brief film by way of introduction.
Hi everyone at WAF, dear friends and colleagues, dear WAF team. Hello from Europe, hello from Germany. ABB is headline partner to the World Architecture Festival for many years today, and it is the first time in 10 years that I am unable to attend. Fortunately, there are 5 ABB colleagues with you in Singapore, and I kindly ask you to connect with Danny, Francis, Chair, Tianqing and Srijit. And please sign up for our newsletter for architects, ABB Frozen Music. We have established so many friendships over the years with you, and certainly one very close is with Sir Peter Cook. Peter has designed this year's ABB Speakers and Judges Lounge again, which I'm so grateful for. It looks indescribably outstanding. Well, what else would you expect from Peter and his team in his new office, Cook, Belacevic, Haffner and Partners? Throughout his career, not only has Peter personally pioneered future and people-oriented spaces, but has brought industry partners like ABB along with him on his journey to inspire and educate global audiences about truly innovative architecture and design. At today's lunchtime lecture, Peter will discuss his observations about European spaces and sensibilities. I wished I could be with you in Singapore to witness his ideas and connotations about the space I am in right now. Peter, welcome. Time for Europe.
Please welcome Sir Peter Cook.
Thank you. I'm very conscious that we're back in Southeast Asia. And I look around the room, I look at the stuff that was on the finalists last night, and I just keep sniffing, and I realize that the ball is in your court, guys. You know, I don't know what we have to offer you. I don't know what we have to suggest or leave behind for you. The impetus is here. So my question today is, so what have we got left? What have we got left to say? I think more than a little, but much of it is not terribly exciting. A lot of it is being suppressed by a sort of wokish atmosphere, particularly in Europe. But let's look at the pictures. Is it charm? Do we have a particular charm? I don't know. There is a certain bourgeois charm of the Jardin de Luxembourg, which sit in the middle of the poshest part of the city, and once arch, formalized, and yet a moment of relaxation. We look at a city like Barcelona, so full of amazing architecture, and I like to think of it not only as a repository for some of the most inventive architecture of the late 20th, early 21st century, but as a garden. I once did a book called The City Seen as a Garden of Ideas. And I think the analogy between the notion of the garden, this thing that is both of nature but is under man's control, dare I say the word, is an intriguing thought. Yeah. Or Berlin as a garden. When you fly into Berlin, which I've done many, many times, what you notice is the trees. Now, when you're in Berlin, it can be extremely tough, it can even be grim. But in many ways, it also personifies the notion of when you have the most intensity, suddenly you open up into a great garden. And the analogy, again, is with the tremendous tradition of inventiveness of a city like Berlin. Or even a perhaps less discussed city such as Lyon, which has also in recent years made itself both a very agreeable place with this sort of hard, flat side on the one side of one of the rivers, and then this intriguing sort of garden-like side on the other side. But many architects have come to Lyon challenged with being able to do some of their naughtiest work in a city which otherwise, has rather old-fashioned food and is not considered one of the exciting cities of Europe? Or is it something, I've never been to Biarritz, but I'm fascinated by the idea of faded glamour. So dare I make the analogy, my God, help, that Europe is a sort of faded glamour in itself? I hope not completely. Or mysterious, very small, very elegant, very arch little German resorts with their villas neatly spaced between a sort of mysterious forest behind. But look at the beach huts. It's Germany, guys. Or even the notion of our remote islands bring on a certain character of challenge, that there is a romantic streak which we can never completely suppress. So that I'm left with the question, to what extent and at what moment will Asia, will Southeast Asia, will Australasia, which has begun to do so, bring on its nostalgias and its nuancing? But here, Gothenburg is one of my favorite cities, only for one really reason, that it uses the connection between the system of the city and the features of the architecture are very interesting, because you notice the canal follows the fortifications. But at the corners of each canal, if you look carefully at the buildings, there's always a turret. You look down this piece of canal, there's a turret. You change direction, there's another turret. Brilliant idea, very simple, very easy to apply. Or, of course, Lucca, which has one of the most ridiculous buildings because it has trees on the top, and nobody's done trees on the top better than in Lucca so far. And, of course, it has this oddly shaped piece of plaza, which, of course, is based on some kind of arena in earlier times. The way the city has congealed around that memory of the plaza. Is European thinking or aesthetics, or dare I use the word mannerism, to do with the picturesque? Is it to do with the picturesque of somewhere like Cadiz, which is the place in which I've experienced the narrowest ever streets? Even the pictures don't do justice to this extraordinary thing of walking in a slit of light. Or then mannered silly streets, such as Botcherstrasse, which is actually Catherine's hometown. I was hoping she was going to be here, so I deliberately put Botcherstrasse in it because I know it irritates her. She doesn't want to be thought of as somebody as fruity as this. But there's a territory for fruit. There's a place for fruit. It's a lovely, silly street. But even something like the existence of waterfronts, and we think of that, of course, here in Singapore particularly, that good waterfronts can absorb a very wide variety of buildings for every mannerism, from every period, both sort of heroic but also suburban. Or a device. Once you have a city with a device, that can also generate a whole lot of sideways ideas, so that if you look carefully at the colonnades in Bologna, you realize that they cover a lot of different architectures, but the principle of walking under cover in shade is in a sense, dare I use the word, insistent. And, of course, color. I think I was lucky enough with Gavin one year here to pick up the color prize. And there is, color is perhaps not just used in dark gray places. I mean, there's this sort of thing that I notice in Scandinavian parts. As soon as the sun comes out, the yellow shutters come out, the blue shutters come out. But I wonder it's an open question, what is the role of color in a hot country? And favorite cities. I love completely stupid cities. I hope there's nobody from Oporto here, but I love it. It is one of the stupidest and most intriguing cities. Well, the main street in the center of the city goes down the hill and doesn't go anywhere. There are two bridges crossing the same position in the gorge. There are the most absurd, cute, funny, mixed-race shops. And some of, I think Rem's best building, perhaps not surprisingly, is in Oporto. Now, recently in London, some geezers have put together a thing called the Design District. What happens when you try to be picturesque? I'm not sure whether I love it or hate it. It is perhaps a warning. Is it to do with intricacy? Intricacy. Because it's something which most commercial architects are very scared of. They don't want to be seen as too fussy and too fiddly, and yet because they're not sure of themselves, they end up in their detailing being extremely fussy and fiddly. Intricacy, I think, is to do with something else. It is to do with space. It is to do with incident in certain kinds of near theatrical spaces. It doesn't just have to be nostalgic. It doesn't have just to be colourful. It just doesn't have to be full of pickpockets. After all, Oxford, which is a very sort of urbane place, the buildings are full of intricate interrelationships, not predictable relationships of treed open space, small open space, alley, round building, square building. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. And it's a wonderful example of sort of inherent, intricate interplay of power, money, influence, religion, dampness, a whole series of things. Even arcades in Europe have a certain intricacy of detail. The principles are simple, but the detail is always full of strange little bits and pieces. And contemporaries of mine, such as Peter Salter, a much hallowed figure in London, though he doesn't live there anymore, made a very, very self-conscious little piece of building, which all the arty people around town love dearly. And it is deliberately intricate. And since he was a student of mine who would always fiddle, I know where that's coming from. So I also am alongside, I'm in what I call the Camillo City syndrome in relation to what I call spooky. On the left, as you see, are some diagrams from Camillo City's books. On the top, a joke, sort of joke, Italian hill town that I invented myself about 3 or 4 years ago, and then interpreted with my own funny architecture. I said, you don't have to do that sort of architecture in order to carry forward the mixture of picturesque and perversity and sometimes logic that makes up a Italian hill town. Or, of course, it can be an elegant intricacy of the scale and precision of Scarpa. Is it to do with audacity? Now, I love audacity. I mean, I'm wearing an audacious tie. We make an audacious structure. I think audacity is something which perhaps, dare I say it, non-Europeans, certainly non-English or certain of the European countries in particular, enjoy audacity, though they express it in different ways. And it is a sort of combination of wit and challenge. My most loved building in Berlin is Ludwig Leo's Umlauftank. And Leo himself is a very curious character who would meet you and then disappear. He was always sort of a will-o'-the-wisp somehow behind there, but only once or twice with a proper conversation. This, of course, was for me, somebody who'd been delighting in the Russian constructivists, and particularly the work of Chernikov. This was Chernikov real. I came upon this building just at the moment at which I was sort of slightly getting bored with constructivism. Suddenly, fuck, it's there. It does it. It's actually there. But, you know, I think there are these certain moments in certain European cities when the preposterous, the challenging, when you look at the section of this building, it's extremely sensible. It works terribly well. But, wow, what the hell was going on? And, you know, I think there's another architect whose work I think is grossly underrated, Jürgen Meyer. It must have been a bit shock to the system in Seville, just when you get very comfortable with these nice Spanish towns and all their lanes and their elegance. Then you go, how about that coming from Germany? Or somebody like Vitra, who after all has dedicated its commercial success towards being a kind of brilliant and intriguing architectural museum. And, you know, everybody slags off Bjarke Ingels. You know, they're jealous, basically, you know, and he can be a bit sort of... But when he's good, his proposition, the preposterousness of this installation in Copenhagen, it's a... Wow, yeah, why didn't somebody think of that before? Or what I would say is the permissiveness. I have been twice the beneficiary of the permissiveness of Austria as absorbing sort of not quite usual architecture, not just of its own, but of coming from other European cities. Or something, if we want to go on the modest side, but not the sort of wokishly modest side, what about the roadside installations in Norway, where they've picked usually young and usually rather intriguing architects who haven't necessarily done much before, and placed them by the roadside, so you're just, bloody hell, what's that? That's nice, let's stop. Architecture has to do that. So it's very closely related, I think, to do with the notion of wit. One of the most witty and intelligent projects, an old project now, is Tumi's Le Fresnoy, where he takes a series of existing buildings and makes the enclosure live on top of those, so that the world of the pre-existent buildings exists and another increased world of quite an early high-tech character is placed upon it. Very few people would dare to do that. They'd either tart up the lower stuff or put the big shed next door, or they'd be nervous, keep the front, leave the back, etc. No, he takes them not just as museum pieces, but as part of the living organism of the total urban proposition. And really, in a funny way that looks very different, Bucky's Dome over New York comes to mind. But then it can be of a very different nature. When you first see photographs of the Villa Maria, it looks sort of interesting, but you don't quite get it, and you have to visit it at least twice, and you start noticing all sorts of very strange, personalized games with edges, the distance between the top and the bottom of things, and how light passes through, and how what seems to be a somewhat eclectic collection of materials actually starts to work together. It's like a very, very well considered sort of suit, shirt, and tie, shall we say, to make a corny analogy. But then there are other things that have been going on more recently. I think that for anybody to enjoy themselves as much as Peter Barber does in, for goodness sake, social housing in London, which is not notorious for being imaginative, dare I say it, but he is. And if he is, others can be. And a couple of architects, I think of earlier years have won prizes at WAF, who I have a lot of respect for, Taman Videgaard from Stockholm. Even in the middle of a very uptight academic institution, the Royal Academy in Stockholm, have done a slightly naughty building and got away with it. And they do a succession of these. I think, again, there's another example coming up. I, of course, was lucky enough to work alongside Enrique Miralles. His widow is still a close friend of ours, and the EMBT actually does a sterling job at carrying on much of his legacy. But I think the last lecture I ever heard him give at the Bartlett, which was a 2-hour-long lecture, was about this building. And he was just, the 2 hours showed he was absolutely enjoying himself. He's doing a fantastic sort of megastructure folding thing, influencing the town. Whether the town knows what it's got, another intriguing question. And here's one I'm going to dwell over a bit more because it's not such an obvious slide. As an academic, or joke academic, or former academic, I have inherited and got to know a number of Spanish architects All of these people, Andreas the least, but all of them are really close friends of mine. And I came upon them here and there and here and there. So Jill Bartholomew, Jill was a student of my wife's at the Bartlett, and really wild, crazy, strange character. Isaskan Chichilla is now a professor there, also one of the nuttiest and most inventive people I know. Moreno and Grinder have been teaching all over Europe, currently at the Angewandte, and they are also an intriguing couple of architects. Andreas Hack, who now is the chair at Columbia, I think you know him more. And my favorite is Pedro Pitar, who Ilias Engelis and I discovered and tried to get to win the Cyprus Museum, but it was won by a boring Greek lady. But in fact, this guy is the most inventive person I've ever come across. And all of them, once you started to, and they're very different, see how different they are, were all students of somebody called Andres Pereira. Not a famous Spanish name, but obviously a brilliant teacher, obviously somebody who could turn around these extraordinary people. And I'm fascinated. But I haven't got time to digress much. I'm always fascinated by the degree of coercion and a sort of a syndrome. If it could be seen that my generation, Archigram, Cedric, all the rest of us, were part of a sort of scene, could then say the people in Detroit in the 50s around the Saarinen, around Cranbrook, etc., and you look at all the Venturas and everybody who came out of there, you say, there must have been something going on in Detroit at that moment. Or you can say, Vienna in about 1910, all those different people. There must have been something was going on here in Etzam, in Madrid. And it fascinates me because I don't think any of us come from under a stone. I think we're all lucky enough to have had people who intrigue us, who coerce us, who are around at the time, and ideas are floating around at the time. And I merely use this as an example of something that can happen in a sophisticated city, in a particularly intense place, though they are all different. That's the other point I want to make. They're all not peas in a pod. They didn't all do Andres Pereira architecture. They're doing each their own very different architecture. I hope I make a point. On the other hand, you can say there are certain particular syndromes of a moment in time in a certain city. And then you can say, well, actually, because Caesar, Sutemora, of course, they're all linked, etc., etc. But when you put it like this, you can say, right, chunk. Portugal, chunk. Apologies to the Portuguese in the room who are probably very unchunky. Or you can say that France is formalist. France is still doing the bubble, is still doing things that some of you may say are slightly dated, but they're still exploring. So you can claim that France can deal with form. Whereas it seems to me, and I repeat this from an earlier WAF meeting, that Belgium is good on piety. And I'm not pious, and I don't like pious architecture. So then I'm put off Belgium. And the fact it's foggy and flat, I can then add to the thing. So here's my inside European prejudice coming out. But I really do find this stuff. This suits, of course, a woke generation. But then you take some pipsqueak place that's smaller than this place and very much smaller in population. They seem to import some quite let's give it a go architecture. I'm intrigued by that. My thesis there is that anywhere can do some interesting stuff if it has a mind. Even if it has to import it or coerce it or use funny materials, whatever the hell. You don't have to be too modest, even if you're provincial. But finally, is it something else that we can offer? Is it knowing how to indulge? I don't just mean what's on the table, or necessarily who's sitting around the table. Just the feeling of let's not only let our hands tear down, but actually indulge? Or is it really good architectural conversations, which I think is what this WAF at best is about?
Peter, thank you very much for that. I've noticed that whenever you go to any city, but I think European cities in particular, you've always got your little black book, part of which is kind of interesting architects and buildings, but part of which is very much, where shall we be having dinner tonight?
Absolutely.
And I wonder if you'd like to say something about the business of consumption. And when you go to restaurants, do you try to find restaurants that are both architecturally and food-wise interesting, or is it the food first, or is it the architecture first?
If you have enough time, you do both. It's great to be with a knowledgeable local, not somebody who's consulted the internet and counted the number of stars. There's nothing better than going down somewhere, usually in a rickety car, and going down a very small side street that looks a bit dodgy, maybe. And then it's a great place, and you realize that's where you go. The other day I was in Vienna, and last year was taken to a restaurant that I must have walked past, because I've been in Vienna a lot over many years. I must have walked past it 20, 30 times, didn't know it was the place to go. Maybe it wasn't in earlier times. Suddenly I go in, I'm taken in there, and 3 people I know are sitting in there. And then I was back there name-dropping with Wolf Pricks. Again, it was where he opted to go. I realized maybe it's this year or this 2 years that's where you go to the Englander. I'm giving the game away now. Englander. But I wouldn't have known unless somebody took me. On the other hand, there are places are great for the camera, and maybe nobody even goes there anymore. But I mean, Vienna again is a very good example with the coffee houses, some of which have reasonable coffee, some of which you go to because you think it's where the action still is, and it stopped being the action 3 years ago, but you didn't know because you weren't local. And other places that just intrigue you for funny reasons, If we're talking about restaurants, I think there's a whole study to be made about in fact, I've written about this in one of my books, the organization of certain restaurants where that's the seat to get if you can, because you're not quite seen, but you can see everybody, and you can exit quickly. Other places where you're being put because you're a tourist. Other places which have a certain relationship to the theatre of how the place works, like the narrow bit of the theatre cafe in Oslo, which is used by the newspaper journalists so that they can see who's coming and go and get straight out to file their coffee. But the tourists are put in another corner, and the tate-or-tating couples are put in another corner under a sort of orchestra platform. It's very interesting, this stuff, and I think it's related to even the orange thing, which had to be done fairly cheaply. There's certain things that we did with it to say, here you can peek, but not here you can go in a corner and not be seen so much. And I'm not going to tell you which is the best table in there, but I know in my head which. That is architecture. It's also experience. And the thing of if you give a lecture, the best conversations are always at the dinner table afterwards, when people actually tell you what they thought about the lecture.
You mentioned that you think this is where Southeast Asia is where it's at. When you come here, do you feel British or do you feel European? Is there a difference?
Oh, you know me. I feel very European. Yeah. I'm more comfortable in Berlin than I am in Manchester, by far.
And when did this become apparent? Because you were a provincial boy. You weren't born in London, but you came to London. Did things change for you at that time?
No, I found that the most interesting people that came through London tended to be Europeans, and then actually they're people who were, selfish things, who were interested in what I was doing, tend to come from elsewhere. And you know, in archigram times, you always used to do a drawing, say, this will upset them. And the them that we never spelled out were mostly the sort of mainstream English critics and, you know, boring architects. And I think also if you have a provincial, moving around, you know, army brat childhood, you become used to having to fairly quickly suss out a town. You look out the bus window and think, I think that's where the fish and chip shop probably is, where the model aeroplane shop is. That's the way to school. That's a spooky street. Don't know about that. Won't go down there. You know, and you have a sort of system. Doesn't always work. I remember trying to use that system in München-Gladbach, and I got totally lost because I hadn't realized that it was München and Gladbach. And when you went onto the railway, it turned into another town. It destroyed my recognition system, but usually it works.
Tell us your long love affair with Los Angeles. Does that persist?
My son lives there, and we spent a lot of time there a year ago, just over a year, and I've fallen rather out of love with America. I found America a bit boring and a bit tacky, actually. LA, I still like wandering around Santa Monica, but that's like wandering around Hampstead in a curious way.
And as far as the East, in its broad sense, are concerned, have you got observations about, say, the difference between Southeast Asia and Japan?
Yes.
Give us an insight.
Japan does it better. It still does it better. Japan, in a curious way, has many parallels with what I've been talking about now. It's a slightly scared society. I was there a few months ago, and it's still great, but it's a bit scared. The initiative has gone elsewhere, but it's still, when it does it, it has this curious mixture of sort of irony and over-sophistication, which I enjoy. And to bring back that word mannerism, it is mannered. And I think it's difficult for full-on emerging countries to handle mannerism very well. Intellectually, they can argue their way by not needing it. On the other hand, if you just have kind of motive, and you just have sort of correctness, and you just have efficiency, there's a certain moment at which the manner in which you carry it, like even this screen behind us is different from last year's screen and has different mannerisms, I think more successful. But it's not a graphics discussion, it's just something that you instantly twig.
And what do you make of the city we're in, or the city state that we're in?
I think it would be rubbish without the trees in a single line. And the fact that it knows that and has bothered with the trees tells you that the first instincts it got right. The individual buildings, it still has more interesting buildings than Hong Kong. You know, Hong Kong started with a wonderful territory, but has extremely boring buildings in the main, apart from, you know, the obvious exceptions.
And what do you think of the sort of great Singapore icons, the Marina Bay Sands and the gardens by the bay?
One of my trips here, it was in construction. The form was just about there, and I'm staying in a hotel in sight of it. And I thought, what the fuck is that? What's going on? And I've never been, you know, I'm not a great fan of Safdie. I think it's interesting, but not the first category. And then as I've used it I realize it's really rather good. And I don't like heights, so I'm a bit scared at the very, you know, where the pool is. But I stayed here once, and somehow the curve, or the angling and the curve thing, made you not feel, it's not one of these sheer wall things. It has, the more and more you come here, the more you say, oh, it's really rather good. The only funny thing is that as I came towards this building, which is a piece of it off on the side with sort of tension wires, you know, it's got all the sort of whiz-bang of, oh, we're holding up the tension. You come in the space, It's just like anywhere. It could be a flat roof building with a sort of asbestos side on the, you know, like it makes you think about what is, but then it's not a lesson in architecture session, but, you know, what it does and how it does is absolutely straight up and down. Could be anything. So therefore, is the roof and the tension wires, is that just a piece of clothing? But then I'm also talking about mannerism, so I should not necessarily object to that, but at least I put it into perspective.
We heard earlier talking about the trees in Singapore, something I hadn't realized, which is that they get a haircut every 2 years. And because they're essentially all state-owned, it's a big national program. And what used to happen was that the trimmings would be taken away from the centre and put into an incinerator. But when they were building gardens by the bay, the environmental engineer, Patrick Bellew, realized that they could take all those trimmings and use them as part of the ventilation and cooling system for that project. So what happens is you get lorry loads of trimmings coming in every day. They chip them and they burn them on site in order to generate power, in order to generate heat, which is used in a turbine to generate electricity, which is then used for the powering of the whole cooling system, which is not air conditioning, it's this sort of underground coils, sort of Roman idea, really. So you get this fantastic kind of circular thing of using something for virtuous purposes rather than simply incineration. And I thought it was a kind of nice analogy about what's going on, this sort of relationship of nature to the man-made these days.
I think what it suggests is that the thing that one admires in Singapore, which I said in a one line, is the trees. That's the surface of a whole interest in experiment. There are more experimental buildings here than other places I've been to. Every building is experiment, but there's quite a serious number of buildings that make you cross the street, sniff around them, and, you know, one's intrigued by the process of, I didn't know about that particular incineration story, but it doesn't matter, you know, it tells you about the ambition, but also the tolerance of a city to say, well, that's a bit weird, but let's give it a go. And I think that's why it is a very fascinating city. Whether it has all the nuances that I was referring to earlier, I mean, I throw into the ring, so to speak. All I'm saying is, you know, take another look at Europe, not so much in has it got good new buildings or bad, or because you won't get anywhere very far. But in terms of certain things that it dealt with, the physiognomy in relation to the lifestyle, in relation to the things that people do other than just go to work, then there are a lot of interesting things that it's accumulated. You don't have to copy them, but maybe you think in parallel.
But I couldn't help wondering, as far as experiments concerned, how many of your categories of width and chunk and narrowness are going to appear in the great experimental project, turn out how it may, of Neom, which we heard about last evening. You're involved in that, and I think I'd be interested in your view about whether you can kind of or you can try, but can you generate the sort of the charms and intricacies that you were talking about as an act of design, or is it something?
Well, that was the point I was making about the design quarter in London. You know, it's sort of very self-conscious. We are going to, each building is different and it's coloured and but then it's a bit plastic you know.
But the weird thing about the width.
I'm not a spokesperson for Neom.
No.
And I'm still involved. So I think and this is a message to anybody in Neom sitting here, there may be, that if we're allowed to, yes, the only thing is that always, at some point in every project, however ambitious, the bean counters come in. Then they say, we don't really need that, do you? You don't really need that, do you? As long as, the pathways are wide enough and the lifts work correct. And I think it's the possibility to build in slack. I think this is something that Cedric would have been very good discussing this. To build in slack, and also to build in the fact that, let's say, 10% of it won't work. And you make it, you plan for that. You say 10% of it, it's life, 10% of it won't work, but we have slack in order to then replace it by bits that do work, or new ideas that come up, or materials that come up. And it's the degree to which it necessarily has to bring on, people with experience in building large things quickly, efficiently. But they don't want you to piss around. So it's a piss around factor against a let's get it up factor, so to speak, which I guess in any project would be so. And I think it's going to be a tricky one for NEOM to deal with in the stages that they're just coming up to now, actually. Beyond that, isn't this a nice idea, isn't this a nice idea? But actually, can you do it? Can you do it by January kind of conversations? I think it's I don't think it's more or less than in any other scheme, except more will be expected of it. So in a sense, it has to, I think, if it's listening, it has to allow for that. It has to build in, at least 10% of funny money or whatever, stuff that will probably go wrong, probably be in the wrong place, but to have the flexibility. Because the whole, in plug-in days, the whole notion of the megastructure was implicit. If it went wrong, you replace it with something else. Or if that particular function doesn't need to be there, you move it to somewhere else. Now, that's what it needs.
Yeah, because, looking at it, it's very obviously, it's a kind of super archigram project. I think the problem with that design district is that it's called the design district, and actually saying, oh, well, we're going to design the design, and you just sort of rather that there was a great area which was where design emerged and architects went and the furniture shops went because they were poor or undiscovered or neglected or redundant or whatever it might be. And there's something about your observation, that business of redundancy or mess where you don't quite know what's going to happen. And during the presentation last night, I was reminded of that remark. It was a historian's remark that sometimes better a fertile error than a sterile accuracy.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think this is your attitude to experiment.
Yeah, you take the history of any sort of architectural interest. It's like, just to take an English example, Stirling produced some awful building and some intriguing building and occasionally a really brilliant building. But had he just been one of these sort of polite English, not so bad, done for, boring but for good reasons, we wouldn't be talking about him.
Do you see NEOM as
Ditto Geary, for example.
Do you see it as an archigram? When this thing happened, did you, as it were, recognize it, just the concept?
No, not particularly. Because, the linear city thing, I'm a close friend of Tom Main, so I know his conversations, and the linear city thing's been knocking around from longer than any of us, Any coastal strip of a fairly developed country is a linear city, actually.
Yeah, Corb did something.
Yeah, Corb did something a bit interesting. Yeah.
North Africa, on the North African coast. I wanted to finally, as we sort of come to a close, to raise your semi-proposition that you might think about Europe mostly as being sort of fading grandeur, and whether you'd like it to be like that. Meanwhile, we see modernity and commercialism running riot in central London and in Paris, and indeed now the height thing happening in Berlin. Can you have both? Can you have the shiny and the faded, living in peaceful harmony?
It's a mixture of taste against available evidence. You know, that taste-wise, of course, I don't want us to be in a sort of well, I'm decrepit myself, it matters. So, but it's a little tragic. But often the best stuff is done at the end of a cycle, and I think we live in a condition where often, I've known this from teaching situations, where there's just something that's really getting really well developed, really to the workable stage, and then the fashion has moved on to the next thing. It has to go through the same cycle, just as it, you know, this great enthusiasm doesn't really work, but let's do it anyhow. And then it starts to get to the sophisticated stage, and then the people that talk a lot drop it, which is probably inevitable. So that I think, but on that one, I don't know if it links, but I come back to the syndrome around the guy in Madrid. I'm fascinated by periods when there's more than the sum of its parts. That's so the Asian city that comes up with the more than the sum of its parts.
Well, I think that's
will be the interesting one.
A nice note to draw to a close, because sometimes you have these movements or moments and you think, this is the start of something really interesting, but then it turns out it was the end of something really interesting, and the next interesting thing will be whatever happens next. Delightful talk, Peter Cook. Thank you very much indeed.
Cheers.